Welcome to the Consummate Athlete podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete podcast, the standing desk edition. You know what? I think we have better energy when we are recording this at our standing desk, which does mean no video. Apologies to those who are really enjoying watching us sit in chairs on YouTube. But
are those people out there? I don't know.
I'm not sure.
I feel like we say this often and then we're having like really bad audio or something as we're trying something experimental and fun, and then it's like, but Peter sounds like he's underwater.
Okay, that happened like one time.
Well, it probably is happening right now.
And we re-recorded, to be fair. Anyway, if you have been watching on YouTube, the episodes are still going up on YouTube. They just do not have a video component to them at the moment. Maybe in the future we'll bring it back, but right now did not make sense. But otherwise, Peter, how's it going?
It's going well. It's been busy. We're having lots of fun this fall. Lots of cyclocross practice and travel and so forth. But yeah, it's good. Is there any updates as far as books and Strong Girl Publishing and these types of things?
Let's see. Misha has done some great talks with sprinting through setbacks, and Running as Fast as We Can came out just a couple weeks ago. I've been hearing from a few people that have, gotten it, read it. Huge thank you to anyone that has. Appreciate it. And people seem to really be liking it, which is awesome. That one has definitely been like the scariest book for me to put out. It's my first young adult novel, and it's a bit more vulnerable. It goes a bit deeper. There's some like tougher topics that are addressed in it compared to, not that the Shred Girls are always rainbows and sunshine. They get into some, tough topics of friendship and stuff like that. But this one definitely, I hesitate to say like it gets dark, but it does get a little bit on the darker, like this is real life side of things. So yeah, a little scary to put out, but I think,
so great really for any Shred Girls that have grown up in the last 3 or 4 years and ready for a next book.
Yeah.
Those that haven't grown up, there you go. You found the secret.
I did tease last week on Instagram stories, though, that there is a Shred Girls book 4 in the works. So any parents who've been huge
didn't tell
fans,
me this.
You knew about this.
I saw the Instagram and I was like, what does this even mean?
You knew about this.
I was going to ask you. Tell us more.
No, I don't want to reveal too much.
Okay, so that's all we get.
We're not there yet. We just know the girls are coming back. So very exciting stuff. Been playing around with that quite a bit. And then we are getting ready for a bike tour we're doing in Italy, which sounds amazing. I'm so excited. I'm having frantic packing, quandaries, but really, really looking forward to, doing some exploring over there. And I mean, it's cyclocross season, but it's also hitting the off season for a lot of people, which leads us to today's podcast question, which is really around training in the fall, the winter, the off season versus just, taking it off, being a little bit, even just like a bit YOLO with your training, which I know is very tempting for a lot of people. So this question was really around the idea of, how can a coach actually get you through the off season, in a good direction?
Yeah. And we've covered this a little bit over the last few weeks. I feel like we were sort of back and forth on even including, we have 2 questions over the next couple weeks we'll cover that are sort of in this direction of like, what is coaching and what is the fall and what is the off season? And I think it's complicated and it's beautiful. It can be anything you want, really, right? There's going to be a solution, much like your training is specific to you and your solution, and whether you work with a coach is specific to you and how you work with a coach or what type of coach.
Yeah.
So we'll hash through that. And then we have one other question, right? That's more training nitty gritty.
Yes, exactly. Do you want to tease that, or do you want to just get right?
I think it's good to tell people right off the bat what they're getting into.
There we go. Okay, this one is really about RPE when you're talking about the session and kind of the overall versus the during an interval and what the whole session equates to if you've done some hard stuff, but the rest of it was easy, etc.
Well, that's right. And RPE being feeling, or like how hard does this feel, which we spoke about before, but again, is always good a reminder for people to review. Maybe you haven't considered it, or you threw it out, or you're new to cycling. So yeah, that's always a great topic to bring back in, because whether we like talking about feelings or not, your feeling is part of endurance performance, if not life. So it is good to sort of like reflect on that and how it relates to training.
Mm-hmm. So I think as we come back to the, training in the fall, winter, off-season question, we have addressed this a couple times in the last few weeks, the idea of it's okay to take a break after your goal race. So I think, one of the kind of misconceptions that if you're working with a coach is that like, okay, your goal race is over, like, boom, you need to be on to the next thing kind of instantly, or like right back into a base building, or, that your coach is there to like instantly start building you back up. But I think, maybe one of the first things to talk about is oftentimes a coach is there to help you actually make sure that you are recovering properly from the work that you've done during the season, the racing that you've done during the season.
And we've done a few articles around this recently, and then I just got interviewed for Canadian Cycling Magazine, did a question sort of like, do you need to take a break after your race or something like that, or in the fall? So sort of the same topic. And in that article, as I was sort of answering the questions, I said there's sort of, if you haven't been pushing your limits, you're not a pro, racing these super gravel races every weekend, or the Tour de France or things like that, then there isn't really a need to do a full 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever you think off season might mean. In the way, sometimes I wonder if some of us, in Canada, it's like, you played hockey in the old days, at least you'd play hockey for the winter, and then you wouldn't play hockey for the entire summer, right? So from April to say September or October, you wouldn't play hockey. You'd maybe play street hockey or play or whatever. That's certainly changed some with, kids taking stuff more seriously. But that would be, I think, where some of our framework for like off season might have come from, was you did the thing and then you took it completely off. And so there's definitely those folks, and I think that's completely reasonable to not do the sport, and go and ski or whatever, right? There's probably the majority of people would hang up their bike and not consider indoor riding. But the question becomes more difficult when you're saying, oh, I want to progress as a cyclist and I want to become closer to an elite level cyclist or an elite master, or pursue goals like Unbound or, Paris to Ancaster or Leadville or whatever the bucket list thing is. This is where we have to look a little closer at your annual training and say, how much break do we want? And that is usually the missing piece when I have someone who is a sport level rider, or what would that be, like Cat 4 or 5, like, more beginner. And they say, I want to cat up. I want to become better. How do I become better? And often that's the piece that's missed. They're taking, from the end of August through till the new year, and they're not bicycling. They're not even working on endurance, right? And that often is the missing piece. They've just, you basically are going to maybe not completely slide backwards, but it's hard to make progress, right? Whereas we would like to keep edging you up a level. And so what you would see with a professional or someone who's very serious about cycling, they might take a week or 4 weeks, maybe 6 weeks sometimes. But they would usually be generally active, hiking, easing into strength training, easing into cross training, and then get back at it. But I would say the majority of my serious athletes who are not injured or ill, or having a major life event, would probably be more in the like 1 to 2 weeks. And that's all assuming, there's lots of presumptions in this, not injured, not sick, not having a major life event. And then assuming that you've been taking rest days and rest weeks throughout the year, right? And that's always like this caveat. You don't have to take a full rest season, off season, if you've been taking regular rest and you have kept yourself healthy and uninjured. So I guess I'll leave it there. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a ton of sense. I think, and me, my bent is always in the routines and habits side of things. I also think, the real danger of when you kind of go like, okay, I just want deconstructed, nothing on the calendar, kind of like non-training for a few months. For a lot of people, that's getting into really dangerous territory on both ends of the spectrum. There's the people who, once they hang up their bike, it's like weeks off and we're completely out of the routine. We're not doing the morning stretching. We're not doing the foam rolling. We're not doing like any, we're not even getting the 150 minutes that's recommended by just, the whatever, doctors of America. I don't know, the government.
Yeah, the government. Yeah.
The government told you to do it. So you're not, you're just completely like out, and it's really hard to restart all of that stuff. As you then kind of like a few months later are like, oh crap, I'm, kind of completely detrained. And now I'm actually like kind of that step back. And I think there's a lot of people who end up in that like off on cycle. So they, move forwards through the season and then kind of go back to square one and then move forward and then back to square one just year over year. And, as we get older, we also know that like VO2 max goes down, we start losing muscle mass, all this stuff. So especially for masters, you can pretty quickly see how you might not just like stall out. You also might just start kind of moving in a backwards direction that we're not super jazzed on. Then there's the flip side, and we always joke like there's kind of like people who need to hear this that aren't going to hear it, and it's on both sides of the spectrum. There's also the people that are like, okay, I'm just going to take some time off of coaching to kind of just like explore some other forms of movement, and I include myself in this 110%. And then suddenly their weekly hours, because they for example, they, join the yoga studio for their, month-long free trial, and suddenly they're going to yoga and Pilates, 5 or 6 days a week. You definitely did the thing
where people are like, I'm just going to do a bit of yoga in the off season. I'm like, that's great. Yoga's a great thing.
I'm just going to do a little bit.
It's just always hot yoga, and they're an hour and a half. And I feel like I'm going to vomit and collapse the rest of the day.
I'm going to do it 17 times a week just to make sure I get my money's worth. And also I'm going to add back in that strength training that I wasn't really doing. And I'm going to get back on the bike and, just like some casual bike rides. Definitely nothing to be stressed about. Definitely not going to go long or hard. And suddenly you're actually like doing significantly more than you were doing when you were just doing the work that you were supposed to be doing, that your coach had given you.
Sure.
So I do think, like it's pretty hard to not do one of those things.
Right. Now you were injured. So this is maybe an example.
To be fair, I didn't do anything too stupid. Like
what? No. I'm saying you were injured when you injured your ankle.
Oh, okay.
At the end of your competitive season, that was your A race. You would have taken time in the best case scenario.
Yeah, for sure.
So, but you also have a pretty regimented routine where you take rest days, and we had weeks, where we were doing other stuff or like at least deloading. So throughout the season, you were pretty good that way, but then you ended up with an injury. So you were pretty much off of like exercise, would you say, for a week?
Yeah, more or less. I mean,
we had to get home, which is, you have to be careful because like, what is rest? That's sometimes the tricky thing is people say, oh, well, I did take a rest week when I had my stress fracture for 6 weeks. And then, when I was injured or I was ill, I had like COVID, and then I got, that was a rest week. And it's like, well, no, those aren't rest weeks. Those are injured weeks. So we talked about last week when we talked about the fact that like stress is stress. Right. And so what we actually want, this is our dream. And this doesn't happen often. It's very difficult. It's sort of like how I say, like, our primary goal when we go to races is to arrive motivated with a functioning bicycle on time at the start line, right? And people are like, well, that's dumb. Of course I do that. And it's like, okay, but when your bike isn't working right off the start and you're a little late and stressed and you didn't warm up and you have that knee niggle, right? That means you didn't achieve that goal. So it's a great goal. Not an easy goal, but it's a good sort of like first goal and to be proud of when you get there, especially as a busy adult. So similarly, when we get to the end of the season, I have this goal where it's like, it would be great if when we got to the rest period, you weren't injured or ill so that you could just have a rest week. And yes, detrain is part of it, but also let that motivation and energy sort of replenish, right? I always think back to Dan Cleather was on the podcast way back, and that's when we were talking about maybe pulling some quotes for some episodes. That he's such a smart guy. In his book, The Little Black Book of Training Wisdom, is a tiny little book, but if you want to understand just training generally, he is not a cyclist, but very skilled with like training theory and certainly strength training, but it all sort of relates. And he has this idea of adaptive capacity. I don't know if it's his idea, but this is where I read it. And it's sort of like a little nebulous and like hard to understand. But the idea is that like you maybe start as a young person, or let's just talk about the season after you take your rest period. Ideally, you'd have tons of room to adapt, right? Tons of energy, if you will, a big fuel tank. And then as you train over the season, that adaptive capacity decreases, right? You're getting closer and closer to your maximum ability, right? You're hopefully in good shape. But the thing is, as you get closer to good shape, your stores for adapting are depleted. Like you're getting towards your limit of what you can handle. And that's why we take a break. We've talked a bunch over the last couple of weeks over, do you step off the peak or do you fall off the peak? So if you try and keep training, you're going to fall off the peak and end up injured, ill, undermotivated, and not having adaptive capacity. So you're going to keep beating your head against the wall, but your body's going to be like, no, there's nothing there. Like I can't get any faster.
Yeah. And I'm excited. In a few weeks, we actually will have my friend Stevie Smith, a registered dietitian, on. And one of the questions we talked to her about is, weight loss in the off season. And one of the things we talked about when it comes to low energy availability, and I think this is super relevant to this conversation, is there's a point where, if you're training at this kind of chronically high level and you're even slightly underfueled, you're actually going to stop losing weight. Similar to, you keep training at this high level and you keep expecting the power numbers to go up and keep improving. Same with, if weight loss is the goal, you kind of expect to see that number keep going down. And there's a point where you actually have the inverted U here where, your weight's actually going to start creeping up because your body is like hanging on to everything. Your power numbers are going to start coming down because it just can't do that work. It can't stay there forever.
Okay. Yeah, that might be like a J or a backwards J curve, not a inverted U. But yeah, I think that's a great message, right? Like, and that's why we talk about that, you can't have the same training stimulus year round, right? You need to mix it up. And sometimes that is less. As much as humans, we hate less. It is sort of the idea. Then we go back and we resume training. And this was the question in that Canadian cycling. It was like, well, what do you do when you come back? Well, you don't go back to max. You ease your way into it. And you start dripping training in. That might be cross training, strength training, and the volume can be lower. And that does allow, you could work with someone like Stevie on nutrition and body composition. That would be a great time of year, to pull the endurance out of it.
Which is exactly what she says. Yeah.
Yeah. So that then your body doesn't need so many calories. And we can eat a little, we'll say cleaner or a bit more protein and veggies because you don't need to fuel at 90 grams of carbohydrate every hour, during your endurance training, right? And your body now has the adaptive capacity to adapt to maybe this, if that is what we're going after is body composition, right? And I often say like the strength training, if you were going, like what do people who are in physique contests or, these bodybuilders and stuff that are the lowest body weight, do they do endurance? Not, they'll do a little bit, but not on the scale we think about, right? They do strength training and they focus on nutrition with, a nutritionist, a registered dietitian, I should say. That's the way we want to steer the boat.
Yeah, exactly.
So these phases of the year are important. And the other pieces I'm thinking through what I talked about in this article, which we'll link to, of course, is just sort of this idea that like we want to step back during this week off. And that week off is doctor's appointments, blood work, bike fixed. And then assuming you're not injured or ill, like if you were injured or ill, then this is doctor's appointments and recovery for, again, that 6 weeks probably makes sense. But if we're just taking that week, you're going to fill a week easily with doctor's appointments, your bike getting fixed, just basic checkups, see your family, do something like that. Most of these times it is like a family vacation. You go to the cottage and you close it up for Canadian Thanksgiving, or it's Labor Day weekend, or it's, that's where usually these things are spent as busy adults, right? It's not like you're sitting at home just like looking at your bike. Your life probably has created a little bit of this naturally, right? And I think that to your point about the routines and habits, that's almost the best way to do it because then you're actually removed from your environment. Just don't bring your bike to the cottage. You take the week, it'll go by. It's great. You come back and then the habits almost start back up because the environment's renewed. The bike is staring at you every day. Whatever, the group ride starts back up, whatever the thing is you do, you sort of like are back in the environment with the thing. And I think that usually works out fine for most people who have been training, for the year prior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But so let's say after the, couple weeks off, I think, again, we're going to have Stevie on and kind of chat about this a little bit too. A lot of people also talk, getting out of race weight when they're kind of in that detraining phase. And I think when we're talking about masters, as you kind of alluded to before, you don't necessarily want to go down to zero. We're not Vanderpool. We're
training.
In training. Yeah. And, what I was going to say is like a lot of the Tour de France guys, the Vanderpools, the Wouts, the, Marianas, all of them, they're probably going to, actively gain a few pounds in the off season because they're at they're at the pointy end. Mm-hmm. But for the average master, I think pretty much any endurance coach at this point has really walked back the idea of gaining some weight in the off season, dropping some weight for the actual racing season.
Yeah, it's not something I've ever really thought about with clients or personally. I think it ebbs and flows, but you have to, of course, observe that like some people do naturally just like it is quick, right? And it could be because they continue eating that way, or it could be, like for some reason that endurance stimulus is really important for whatever reason, right? Whether it's the actual endurance stimulus or just you're not at home during that period or something. So, you would have to take a bit of a personalized approach to that. I do know, that whole race weight concept, even for the pros, I think is less, I think, as you're getting towards like the most elite level, yeah, it might be a few kilograms, but in general, there's always the news story of like this person was 20 kilograms heavier at the Tour de France. Like that was the story this year, was that the guy actually gained for the Tour de France, right? That was the big news, that like he got heavier and got faster.
Although when you like pulled that out, he didn't gain it specifically for the Tour. In the last like 3 years,
right,
he had gained like 30 pounds of muscle, and now he's actually he's no longer in low energy availability.
Right.
He's like, I like girls now. Like actual quote from him.
Okay. Yeah. And that's it, right? And that's a lot of times with clients, it's sort of this idea, the weight loss is tricky. We can certainly work with someone, but there is sort of this idea of going through the training and making sure that all that stuff's crossed off, because that's something that's a little bit more controllable for a lot of us, right? It is sometimes the weight is sort of the weight, and it is what it is, right? So, we can struggle over that and struggle, or again, we can sort of adapt and go with the exercise and again, consult with someone like Stevie if that's an important piece of it.
Yeah. And I mean, I also think like leaning into, there's a bit of the like body neutrality stuff. And again, like this is, more stuff we're going to get into with Stevie, but like also leaning into the discipline that makes most sense for you. Like at some point, maybe you are better at endurance because you have this body type. And if you're trying to fight it all the time, you're not going to be as good.
Right. And we see that a lot. Yeah.
We see that so much.
Both, with everyone. Okay. And we do see it with the gravel as well, where it's like this stuff's getting so long and it's, hilly, but it's not the same as, a cross country or like the Tour de France where it's, very, very mountainous. A lot of these things are just rolling hills, right? And they do reward someone who's healthy and motivated and well fueled for sure. For sure. And, I find it even in gravel races that I'm too small a lot of times, and we get onto the flat and suddenly we're doing well over 50 and 100 watts higher than I can hold for any duration of time, which then gets into like, well, is that watts per kilogram or is that watts? And it's just watts, right?
Yeah.
Which does reward the people who are bigger, taller and just bigger.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so sorry, I've taken us off on several tangents.
Now we're talking weight loss and hand wringing.
I apologize. I apologize for that. Anyway, so we've detrained. We've had our couple weeks off, and now we're just kind of looking at this looming space in the calendar between now and next season.
Right.
What do we do?
Great point, right? So a lot of times clients will be, I gotta keep training, and it's like, well, you haven't reviewed the season past. Was it a success? What were you happy about? What do you need to work on? And then it's like, well, then you need to plan the next season. And this answers a lot of the questions of how much time do you have? How much time can you afford to take off? Afford in quotes, there's always, you got to take care of what you have to take care of. But if you're not racing till June, it's obviously less critical that you're just, firing off intervals all September and October. But you may remember that, your June race had a bunch of drops and jumps that you rode around and you were really scared when you went to the race and it was too technical or too hilly or too whatever the thing is. You got all these flats and couldn't fix them. Whatever. You got back pain, your bike fit isn't good. These are all things that, you review the season. And then in the fall usually is a great time to address these things, right? Oh, they were talking about fueling at 90 grams and I've been fueling at 60 grams. Go and do a bunch of endurance rides and try having 2 gels an hour, versus 1. The bike fit thing, get it addressed and then ride it a bunch and see what happens on similar terrain with a bit of intensity. What else could we, I've been trying, we went to Leadville with you and it seemed like a lot of the guys are using fuel belts more, okay, well, this is it. We haven't used fuel belts. Well, let's get some fuel belts and see what it's like. What do we find?
That they suck. Fuel belts are the worst.
Don't do it. Resistant.
Hate them.
Resistant to change.
I'm resistant to fuel belts.
So now we're trying that, right? And again, one of my focuses is okay, well, let's get these new gels and let's see what it's like to fuel this much. Can my gut handle it? Okay, it gets better over time. You got to train the gut. Interesting. Okay, and then there's just so much. You just can start making a list. We all have mechanical, technical, tactical, nutritional, all the AL words. That we can improve on, right? You could probably pick one from each of those categories and spend October, November, December, January ticking away at those things, right? Even if you're indoors, a lot of these things can be done indoors or even cross training, right? You can fuel at 90 grams while you're cross country skiing or running or whatever, right? So yeah, hopefully that makes sense that you're going to review. But if we just ignore the season pass and just start like screaming that we want to train, that's to me strikes me as like, that's like exercise. Like now we're exercising. We're not training for something or based on anything. You're just burning a bunch of calories, which could be okay. But if you're asking me as a cycling coach what you should do for training, then we need to know what you've done in the past. What are the limiters? What are the strengths? We want to preserve and really be proud of our strengths. And then we want to go forward into the next season with a plan that, has you arriving, fit, healthy, motivated with a functioning bike on the start line on time. Right? Yeah.
Love it. But all of this like can fit in, working with a coach, like that's kind of the point, is that you're going to do this review. We're going to work and figure out how this stuff actually fits in versus kind of this like willy-nilly, I'm going to go to the jump park and do 18 hours because my jumping was not great, or I couldn't get over stuff on the bike.
For sure. And a coach, can help guide that. We try and encourage clients. We have like a call booking where we do a bit of a reflection and then we get together and talk about it, review in the way I'm just describing. And then, maybe a coach can also help you that's cued me off there. That like technical thing is sort of, well, how do you work on that technical thing? But then also, you have to almost prioritize and think about what you can work on, right? Some people, the jumping probably is a thing, but is it the biggest thing? Can you actually make progress on it? Is it safe? Sometimes it's like, you're not jumping, but I don't know, maybe you shouldn't be jumping that much. I don't know. Or do you want to invest the amount of time and energy into jumping versus something else, right? Maybe it's just strictly fitness and endurance building.
Well, or is there like a strength or mobility component that needs to be addressed prior to the jumping? Because I think it's very easy to go from like, oh, I couldn't get over that, I couldn't jump this thing, to like, okay, I need to go do jumping practice. But a lot of the time, okay, there's actually some like literal like on the ground jumping, like with your feet. You call that like
capacity. So does someone have like the movement capacity? Yeah. And sometimes I will check that, right? Like, can you jump on your feet off the ground? And then, it's not the exact same thing as on a bike. A bike does have like momentum that helps you, but if you're stuck to the ground on your feet, it's I don't know. I guess I'd guess that most people would not be able to jump a bike if they can't jump on their feet. But
and there's a core and upper body component involved and stuff like that. There's potentially like some injury repair and recovery that needs to happen prior to that.
Yeah,
there's
like
just like
why?
a lot
Why
of
is that capacity? So it could be pain. It could be someone told them not to jump or whatever, right? But then now you're just untangling a whole hornet's nest. Like now we're at the therapist, right? Which again, not a bad way to spend your September, October looking into these.
My mother told me I'd never be an athlete, and now I can't.
So you have these psychological blocks, right? And I don't say that at all joking. We're sort of laughing, but if that's a block, that could be the limiter to the jumping and then also the race results. So start down that path. Like we have several clients, fall is the time that we start talking about this again and thinking about it and trying it out, because you're not at your A race where we don't want to try anything new. Now is the time to try the new stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So, we've addressed that stuff. Where do we go from there? What are we thinking about as far as like the actual, let's talk cross training, let's talk staying on the bike. How are you kind of looking at that and working through that with people? Because I know you have some clients where there is a lot of indoor training. Some clients, Noah, who just had a couple great World Cup results, he'll be going places to ride all season rather than, spending a lot of the winter indoors. But then there's also clients who'd rather do a lot of their work on skis, on snowshoes, on fat bikes.
Yep. I think the cross training is a great way to do it. The hesitancy would be that we don't want you to become so detrained that we have to build it all back up. But there you certainly should have some detraining, some like letdown of the load, assuming it was at a decent height, right? And that's always the like, where is that? But that would be part of it. And I think cross training, assuming it's cross training that is cardiovascular, when we're talking strictly about cycling cross training, so you're hiking, you're running, you're Rucking is more popular now, where you walk with a weighted backpack. Skiing, snowshoeing would be classic ones. And so you'll see, it used to be even pros would do months without even bike, or at least a month, where it would be just like heavy cross-country skiing and time in the mountains. And then they would come back and introduce the bike gradually. So I think that's a great way to do it. Now, the mix depends a bit on your environment, right? If you live somewhere and you have all day to train, then you probably can fit in biking irregardless of weather. If you live in the city and have winter, then you're probably indoors a fair bit, and cross training is tougher. A lot of athletes I work with can't run, right? They don't run because of knees, or they've just never been a runner. They don't like it. Running has its own risks, right?
Which is totally valid.
It is a very risky sport as far as like the number of runners that get injured in a year, right? That always gets thrown out. I don't know how true that is ultimately, but we know a lot of runners, and there is a fair bit of injury. They're not, broken arms usually, but it is things ranging from stress fractures and just knee pain, right? When we talk about injuries. So all that to say, it's sort of just finding that right mix. But I would say increasingly more and more people this fall time, we start introducing strength training. So we talk about just easing into that, maybe with 10 minutes in the morning to start, or something like one set of 8 for maybe 8 exercises is a classic one we start people with. It doesn't have to be fancy. And then, just maintaining that bike. So that might look like a bit of trainer time. I think it could include a bit of intervals, but just not excessive intervals, right? It's something, if you're used to doing 5x3, maybe you sprinkle 3x2 to 3 throughout a workout, and that might be outside or inside. I'm usually hesitant with too much of the online Zwift racing and that sort of stuff, but certainly it could be, one of those a week and just not excessive. I always say, like, don't enter the most competitive one. You don't need to win. And then on the weekend, again, it could be maybe a bit of a group ride, a fun ride, maybe something with a bit of technical skill if you're a mountain biker especially, and then maybe just a long, slow distance on Sunday, which again, that's where you might see rucking or like a long hike or a backpacking trip fit into some of those Sundays. I really like one of those workouts on the weekend to become at least partially, cross-training time in nature. So again, just it might be an hour on the trainer, and then maybe you go out and walk with your family, even in the city, right? But maybe get onto some paths and some stairs and things like that to make it a little bit of to have a bit of variability. But that's the idea. So that would be what we call like preparation, or like an early base phase, where there's lots of cross training. It's pretty general. The load is not super high. You'll see a lot of people who, if you're used to 8 hours a week, it's maybe 5 to 6 for a few weeks. If you're used to 12 to 14 hours, it maybe looks like 7, 8, 9 hours type thing. Again, spread across strength training, cross training, biking. So I don't know, does that make sense?
I think it does, yeah. And I mean, the really key here is to be as set up for base phase as possible, so that when you hit base phase, you're actually able to, really hit it. And again, so we're not just having that reset back to square one, and now like we're gonna have to spend all of base phase like getting back up to the point you were at, last year.
Well, and that's why I like the name. All these names are sort of made up, right? There's lots of different names for phases depending on the system you're using and the sport and stuff. But I do like preparation, because it's sort of giving you that's what we're doing. So you're preparing that the strength loads can go up if you want, right? So one set of 8 can become 2 and 3 sets of 8, or 5 sets of 5, or whatever you want to do. But you work through the initial soreness without doing anything excessive. You learn the movements, you acquire the equipment. Cross training. So running, we start with walking and running, for 30 seconds every 5 minutes, and we progress that 30 or 40 minute walk. Eventually it will become more of a run. The hike, the ruck, distances and weights can increase there. The bike, the intervals are low key, maybe unstructured, and then can become more structured and less low key. So if you were doing, again, just something like maybe you do 2x10 tempos in a 1 hour trainer ride or something like that, right? And that could be outside. It's just here at home, we have 10-minute climbs all over the place. So you climb 2 climbs during your ride. And I don't even care what the recovery is between. You do one at 20 minutes in, and you do one at 50 minutes in. But then when we get into the base phases, especially as your later base phases, you might start doing like the same hill 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 times maybe, or the same trainer intervals where it's like 2 minutes between or 3 minutes between those intervals, right? So the preparation phase was sort of saying like, hey, don't forget the intervals and like what it feels like to go hard and sort of spinning the tops is sometimes the analogy I like with that. And then you can get more specific, however that looks for you and your goals as you get deeper into the winter and closer to the spring or closer to that goal.
Perfect. Okay, so I think, do you have anything else to add there other than, if this is something you're interested in, if you're trying to figure out what to do, you can definitely, head to consummateathlete.com, book a call. The 3-month custom plan is also a kind of a good way to, ease into the idea of coaching without actually having like a full-on coaching thing. Although obviously, if you're interested in that, we have that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a whole range. Mm-hmm. There's the phone consults. So last week I did one where it was just like, hey, I want to do, I'm not going to name the sports, but, there's like this sort of strength training, martial arts type sport. And then there's like, another sport, an endurance sport. And how do I mix this into a week? What would that look like this time of year? This is the race I want to do in the next little bit. And then in the future, this is what I'd like to do. What do you think that looks like? We just talked through it on the phone. They took notes and away they go, right? That can work great for people. And then the next step would be that 3-month plan, like you say, where we build the 3 months based on that conversation. And then we probably have 2 spots left as far as coaching for the next year. But that is sort of an ongoing thing where we are looking at this over the next, 2 years. What do you want to do with your life? And we sort of map that out for you. And that's the nature of coaching, right? We think long-term and consistent over time.
Love it. Okay, let's get into our quick hit question around session RPE. So I'm going to read the whole question here. So what is the overall perceived effort? So your RPE, usually a scale of 1 to 10. Again, perceived exertion, so how hard something felt, when one interval is hard at, like, say, a 7, but everything else is a 3. Okay, so I interpret this question 2 different ways. So maybe I'll ask the first question that I think it's asking is, what is the overall perceived effort of the workout? Like, how do I record it? What do I say it was when one of the intervals is hard, but everything else is easy? So this is maybe only a couple minutes worth of hard work in the session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's 2 definitions. So there's session RPE, which is you finish your workout, maybe you showered, and then like someone who doesn't understand the sport comes up to you, your spouse or your kids, is like, hey, how hard was that workout on a scale of 1 out of 10, given all the workouts you've done in your life? And you answer with a number between 1 and 10. So Molly's done, big long races and short races. You've done 5K races.
Problem is, I think I'd just say everything's a 5, so I'm a bad example.
Most people, all their workouts are 5s. And so that's like the cliche of endurance training. And that's why do we even assess this, right? This is a very valid question. I can't even give you a great answer why we do this. I think it's a good idea. I believe it's going to be a better idea in the next couple of years, but I can't like convince you and tell you 100% that this is worth your time. So I'll give you that caveat right off the bat. But Molly finishes, showers, a little kid says, hey, how hard was that? And you say, well, one time I did this like 50-mile race and I collapsed at the finish line and I couldn't function for the rest of the day. I was so screwed. And that was a 10 out of 10. And then I've also gone for a ride with my niece to the park and it was like a 0 or 1 out of 10. I could have done that for many days on end. This workout, you had some strides in it, that were 20-second pickups where you ran, but otherwise it was a very normal run for you. Not really that hard otherwise, just a couple little pickups. What would you rate that workout out of 10?
Like a 2 or a 3.
Okay, yeah. Great.
Side note, my mother, we took her to the Lake Placid World Cup, and I've never seen her so upset when the elite women finished, and Luana Lecomte was like on the ground at the finish line. My mom was there watching, and she was beside herself.
Right. So they fell over. She couldn't support. She didn't even, not even one of these ones where like she gently sets the bike down. She actually just fell over to this. I'm surprised she didn't hurt herself. And just arms above head, laying on the ground, just breathing.
And my mother is just sitting there, just muttering to herself, oh my God, where is her mother? Where is her mother? Oh my God. So hilarious. Shout out to Noreen Herford there.
So that could be a 10 out of 10 if they weren't just doing soccer dives at the end of the race.
Not saying they were.
So yeah, so I don't like to see a lot of 10. Some people really like these suffer vomit intervals where their spouse has to come down and help them up the stairs at the end of their super cool trainer workout. I tend to think that those are a little excessive.
You could not be more sarcastic when you said that.
And your spouse shouldn't have to help you up the stairs from your workout. We save those 10 out of 10s for the race, which for most masters is once or twice a year. You go really deep and do the thing you were supposed to do at the day you were supposed to do it. That's called performance. So that's often what's missed. So part of what I'm looking for with these session RPEs is it what I expected as the coach when you completed it? So if Molly came back and she was stressed and it was super hot and she had randomly decided to go to altitude, she still did her strides, but it felt like the hardest workout ever, even though she always runs 5 miles with 6 by 30 seconds. No, they were 20 seconds. 6 by 20-second strides. This workout at altitude was super hot while she was stressed because someone sent her a bad email before the workout. This was like a 8 or 9 out of 10. She didn't want to do it. She wanted to quit from the beginning. So she said, this felt like it sucked. And I was 8 out of 10. This was so hard to get through. Like I almost quit. I was at my limit the whole time. Right? You can see how that could happen if you were honest with this RPE, session RPE scale. So that's really the utility. The other thing that can happen is you can have an athlete and you just, like I have a bunch of new athletes have started with us here in the fall. You're learning, like I'm learning about them, right? Like, and power and heart rate tells you a bunch what they've done in the past, but you also want to get a feel for like, what can they handle? And so sometimes you'll be like, oh, I thought that was a really hard workout. And they were like, yeah, no, I can do that all day, right? There's some people are like, I have clients that just amaze me with like, they can roll 5-hour rides. And like, to me, that's the end of the world. Right. And they're like, no, like I would do that every day. I love biking and I love being on my bike. And so you have to triangulate this a little bit that like for them, that's like a 2 or 3 out of 10, which could be okay, but like, it's not a big deal for them. They're just endurance monsters, right? Like these are the people out there. Right. So for the coach, I think it's very useful to just triangulate. Like I thought this was going to be like an 8 out of 10 and you're calling it a 2 out of 10. And then we can have a discussion. Often it's the scale isn't quite understood. So that's the idea. So just to bring this home, there's also RPE during the workout.
Wait, before you do that. So someone who did like say a 10-minute interval in their workout and it was really hard. It was that 7 out of 10. Like their session RPE could still be 7 out of 10 if they felt like it was like a really that was a really hard interval and I'm like pretty cooked from it.
So this would be like a test. So you do like a 5-minute TT. I'm trying to think like a running analogy that like you don't really do that much testing, so it's sort of tough. But that's the idea, right? It's so like you do, I use a 5-minute TT quite often. It's like not that big, partially because the session RPE isn't that high. Yes, I expect you so that actual question, I'm like, well, why wasn't that a 10 out of 10 for the 5-minute time trial? Were you holding back? And that's the confusing part is, in the workout, at any point, if I asked you during the 5-minute TT and you told me you were at a 7 out of 10 during a 5-minute TT, I would say, what are you doing? Like,
right.
Go harder, right? Like maybe early in the 5-minute, like at, minute 1 of 5, maybe you're like, oh, I'm okay. And then it gets real, right? That could be paced okay. But this is usually, if you've ever done like an incremental exercise test, a VO2 test in a lab or at a university or something, and they gradually increase it, they'll keep asking you at every stage, how hard is this stage? How hard is this stage? And so you'll start and you'll be like, this is easy. It's a 1, it's a 3, it's a 4, it's a 5, 9, 9.5, 10, or something like that, right? Some people, the scale isn't linear. They go from like a 4 and then they just fall over, which is like some very fit people because their aerobic threshold's so high. So they're cruising, they're laughing, and then they're like a fainting goat or something and they fall over. So anyhow, that's in the session, you're saying like how hard it is. And we're always doing this in our head. We don't always use this arbitrary 1 out of 10 scale. Sometimes we're just like, this feels way too hard, or this feels just right. This feels like I can hold it. I'm never going to be able to hold on, right? We're always triangulating feeling. So this is where people don't want to talk about feeling, but like everything is paced off of feeling and your expectations for it, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what we're getting at. So I think that's very normal, but with something like Training Peaks, where at the end of the workout, they ask you, how hard was that workout? It's session RPE. So if your 5-minute time trial workout, you go out, you do the time trial, and then everything else was easy, you cool down really nicely. And by the end of it, you're like, I could have ridden more, right? Then it wasn't a 10 out of 10. Like 10 out of 10 to me means that like you couldn't have done anything else. right? So that's the idea, is that the session RPE is different from this RPE during it. And then the RPE during it, there's no wrong answer, but if this is a max effort, then it should be a max effort during it. So you would have 10s, right? Like a sprint could be a 10 out of 10 effort during it, right? And your strides might even approach 7 or 8. Strides aren't generally maximal, but they're very fast. You don't necessarily have a ton of room to accelerate during them. But again, because they're sprinkled throughout the workout, you might not even remember that you did strides by the end of it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, and before we wrap up the back half of this question, I just want to read out, like, if I compare it to the last time I did this interval, my average heart rate was higher, but average speed was a bit lower. And they don't really have a question around this, but I do want to call this out as just, like, irrelevant to RPE.
Irrelevant, but interesting, right? You always have this triangulation. So, I mean, that is interesting. Did it feel easier or harder given those stats, right? What we'd prefer to see is probably the opposite of that, right? Where it's feeling easier, the power is higher, the heart rate's like normal or even lower, perhaps.
I think what I almost want to say, though, is like, I think when you're rating your session RPE in your notes, you should be kind of doing it blindfolded. Like, this should be something you're thinking about before you look at the numbers.
Yeah.
Or like without taking the numbers into consideration, because like the numbers essentially decoupled is maybe not the exact right word, but do you know what I mean? Like the actual numbers are kind of decoupled from how it felt. Like the point of asking what the perceived exertion is to talk about how it felt, not how you performed.
Exactly. Yeah, you wouldn't want to. So that's what you'll see sometimes is people try and cheat it, where they're like, okay, this was 70%, so I'm going to put 7, which isn't necessarily how I use the scale, but that's not really, it's not supposed to represent heart rate. Like, there might be like a correlation there generally, right? Where, the lower ones correspond with your endurance heart rates, and then the higher ones, your heart rate's higher. But yeah, that's not really the idea. The scale isn't linear, right? Where we expect heart rate to sort of like increase and increase and increase with power. The feeling could be really high or slightly higher, again, because of fatigue or because of stress or because of altitude environment type stuff.
Yeah, like if all you're doing is basing your RPE on what the numbers are telling you, that's not actually your RPE.
Right. And as an example, like this is less common. Most people, because they don't train a ton, their heart rate they are always worried about it being higher. But with a highly trained athlete, you can start seeing like a depression. So that's what I've always struggled with, maybe also with depression, but heart rate depression or suppression, where the heart rate's low, but you feel like you're working really hard. Maybe people have felt this when they've been away on a camp or at a stage race, where you feel like you're pushing, but every day your heart rate goes lower and lower and lower across the week. And so that would be a situation where like it would be actually good to tell the coach and reflect in your training peaks that like this felt muscularly very hard. I felt like slow. It's not just that I was cruising, and you can see, again, this is not what you would expect. This is why I really like riding with power as someone with a heart rate that can be like sticky, depressed. Because if I don't have power, I could be pushing well into like zone 3, like above my aerobic, what you would think. And the feeling can be like I'm working really hard. But if I don't have power, then the heart rate is low and you feel like you suck because your heart rate's like 55%. But then the power is up, but you don't know that if you don't have power. And then the feeling is like, well, I suck because it's hard to push 55%. But so then that's where power can be really nice during the workout sometimes. Mm-hmm. But you still, in that, even if you had power, you'd want to know that like it felt very hard. So like this was like a 5. And then you could be like, oh, wow, the heart rate was low, but it was a 5. So this person probably needs recovery, or like we should look at fueling, or right, which is all very true for me as an athlete, is that like probably I should recover more and eat more. And that's often the way. Yeah.
So just as you're thinking about RPE, just make sure you're not taking the numbers into account before you like look at it. Just try to kind of like, what would I say if I didn't know any of the data? Mm-hmm. Which I think is very easy for me because I don't pay attention to data during the actual thing. But I know it's tricky when you're someone who's looking at your computer during the intervals and sort of knows whether the workout went quote unquote great or quote unquote crappy.
Well, it is next level to be able to, because I mean, you will see that during your workout probably, unless you're blinding it. So it is to be able to back up and just say like, oh, feeling like I feel like this is a good pace, even if the heart rate isn't quite in the zone or the power is lower than you expect. So often we want just this, tell me what power to do and I'll do it. but that's, again, the body doesn't work like that. There's all these other factors that can play, and it's not even linear. Like I say, the heart rate can be paradoxical to what you would expect, right? You think that like you're getting tired, you're getting crappier, so your heart rate's going to be higher for the power, but it can actually go the other direction. So when we know that, you just have to be careful that you're observing like what is the feeling, and letting that rule it. At least be noting it, because if you start seeing that, one day is not the end of the world, but if you see fatigue over days and weeks, right, and people will just keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and that's where we get into trouble, right? That's like overtraining doesn't happen in a day, but it does happen over weeks and months.
Mm-hmm. Love it. Okay, let's wrap up there. As always, hit us up with questions, comments over at consummateathlete.com or at consummateathlete on Instagram. If you have not done so, definitely head over and do a quick rating and review of the podcast. It is super, super, super helpful. Very much appreciated. And with that, we will see you next week. Happy training. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.